At the state opening of the first Northern Ireland Parliament on the 22nd of June 1921, King George V pleaded for forbearance and conciliation in Ireland, thus providing the right atmosphere for a peace initiative and an end to the escalating guerrilla warfare between the British Crown and Republican forces. Whether or not the King was instrumental in initiating subsequent events which led to a truce being called the following month, and which resulted ultimately in the Anglo-Irish Treaty at the end of the year, it was certainly in both Britain's and Ireland's interests that hostilities should cease. From a British perspective, the fact that Ulster was now secure enabled the government to consider entering negotiations with Sinn Féin in order to conclude a political solution for the rest of the island. Lloyd George was by now acutely aware of the unpopularity and growing unacceptability in Britain of the continuing Anglo-Irish War. Furthermore, the official policy of reprisals and counter-terror was damaging Britain's international reputation. In Britain, deep revulsion and outrage was articulated most effectively by church leaders, trade unionists, newspapers, and opposition politicians. For Lloyd George, it was obvious that he now had only two options to pursue in Ireland, either an all-out war and military rule, or a truce and subsequent negotiations. This, allied to the Prime Minister's realisation that Irish nationalist demands for self-determination now far outstripped the original modest demand for home rule, and that Sinn Féin did articulate the wishes of a majority of Irish nationalists, propelled the government towards a truce. It was also apparent that the Government of Ireland Act of the previous year was now a dead letter in the south, with the result that a political and constitutional vacuum was now looming in most of Ireland. How was it now to be governed, given that Sinn Féin had resolutely rejected the concept of a Home Rule Parliament in Southern Ireland, complementing that of the newly created Northern Ireland? At the same time, Sinn Féin and the IRA were also facing a potential political and military crisis. The capture of men and weapons and the effects of war weariness meant, as IRA leader Michael Collins later admitted, that the Republican guerrilla campaign could only have survived for another 3 weeks from the date of the truce in July 1921. Collins also realised, more so than some of his comrades, that the logic of an underground army emerging from the shadows meant that a political agreement, no matter how unpalatable to some, was inevitable. A military truce, the longer it continued, would not only innovate the cutting edge the IRA provided to the Republican campaign, but, once out in the open, it was almost impossible to ever again recover the mystique and effectiveness of a previously subterranean guerrilla struggle. Consequently, it was in both sides' interests to call a halt to military action and instead seek a political solution to the Irish crisis. The July 1921 truce started a convoluted series of discussions between London and Dublin, which meandered on until the following October, when meaningful discussions and negotiations began. During these preliminaries, Lloyd George offered De Valera Dominion status such as Canada or Australia, but rejected any unravelling of the Government of Ireland Act, which had set up Northern Ireland the previous year. By the time formal negotiations commenced in October 1921, Northern Ireland was established with a functioning parliament and government. Departmental responsibilities and a security service were in the process of being established in the north, while the treaty negotiations were taking place. In effect, a unionist state was already a reality. When the negotiations started, the Irish delegation concentrated on the future constitutional relationship between Ireland and Britain, whether the new Ireland should remain in the Empire, and whether an oath of fidelity should be given to the British monarch as head of the Empire. These were largely symbolic issues, but essentially avoided the emotive issue of partition. Basically, the Irish argument was for the British to stand aside and allow Irishmen to resolve their differences, whereas the British promoted themselves as being motivated by no more than benevolent neutrality, but were adamant that the Government of Ireland Act had already established Northern Ireland and that therefore Ulster could not be coerced into an unacceptable constitutional arrangement. Lloyd George was acutely conscious, however, that continuing to refuse to allow a plebiscite in Northern Ireland ran counter to the Treaty of Versailles and the current fashion for self-determination. The plebiscite to determine the disputed Silesian frontier between a defeated Germany and the new Poland occupied much of the news during 1921, and Lloyd George knew that he could expect to be attacked on this front by the Irish delegation at some stage during the negotiations. The problem for Lloyd George was that the outcome of any county plebiscite in Northern Ireland would inevitably transfer Tyrone and Fermanagh out of Northern Ireland, thus undermining the Government of Ireland settlement of the previous year. The negotiations which led to the Anglo-Irish Treaty in December 1921 began in October and continued in a desultory manner for the next 2 months. From time to time, Ulster would occupy centre stage, but most of the discussion was on the constitutional relationship of Ireland to the Crown and the wider British Empire. Once it became apparent in November that the Unionists remained obdurate, refusing to even consider an All-Ireland Parliament or a reduction in the size of the Northern State, Lloyd George offered the Irish delegation the prospect of a boundary commission to determine the nature of the border between the two Irelands. Even at this stage, the Irish realised that such an offer could, at the very most, transfer nationalist areas to the south, but would never result in the implosion of Northern Ireland and the resulting unity of the whole island. Nevertheless, the Irish delegation, and Arthur Griffith in particular, agreed not to oppose Lloyd George on the Boundary Commission proposal, as he attempted to browbeat the Unionists with the threat of one coming into operation. He also pointed out to the Unionists that the future tax burden for Northern Ireland would be far more onerous if it remained part of the United Kingdom, rather than becoming part of an all-Ireland dominion. Northern Ireland's response was even more stubborn, with Sir James Craig demanding Dominion status for Northern Ireland separately from the rest of Ireland. This was probably the most difficult time for the Ulster Unionists during these negotiations, as their audacious demand alienated many of their previous supporters in Britain and caused anxiety to their Conservative allies, who realised that public opinion in Britain was not as sympathetic to the plight of the embattled Unionists as it had been a decade earlier during the Ulster crisis of 1912-14. However, the Unionists held their nerve. The proposal for some sort of all-Ireland assembly, which was preferred by both the British and Irish negotiators, was dropped, and debate moved towards the Boundary Commission proposal, which all sides knew could, at the very most, involve some sort of readjustment of the border. The Boundary Commission was first formally proposed at negotiations in mid-November. The British proposed that if the Northern Parliament refused to participate in an all-Ireland Parliament, then a commission would be established to determine the boundary between the two parts of Ireland. What was to become Article 12 of the Anglo-Irish Treaty stated quite clearly that a boundary commission, quote, shall determine in accordance with the wishes of the inhabitants, so far as may be compatible with economic and geographic conditions, the boundaries between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland, end quote. The Irish managed to alter the conditions so that each government could appoint a commissioner rather than the British appointing all members, but they failed to challenge the phrase economic and geographic conditions, which was to have such implications for the amendment of the boundary when the Commission met in 1924-25. Furthermore, the Irish negotiators failed to demand specific information as to whether the Boundary Commission would have the ability to make recommendations all the way from small-scale land transfers to making all of Northern Ireland unviable. It's as if all of Sinn Féin believed that in some mercurial and unspecified way that the Boundary Commission would deliver for the South. After all, the Anglo-Irish Treaty theoretically postulated one government for the whole island, even though Northern Ireland was given the opportunity of opting out. When the draft treaty was discussed in Dublin, De Valera rejected the right of any part of Ireland to opt out of the new Irish state. Nationalist Ireland was prepared to allow Northern Ireland to retain its own territory, except for local plebiscites to determine the exact nature of the contested border, its own parliament and government, as long as these were subordinate to Dublin rather than London. This was known as essential unity, but overall, the discussion on Ulster was overshadowed by other issues, such as the proposed oath of fidelity to the King, with the result that when the Irish proposed amendments to the British draft treaty, none of them included any reference to Ulster. The British accepted some of these Irish amendments, and on the evening of the 6th of December 1921, the Irish signed the treaty. When the treaty was debated in Dublin, the cabinet was split, and Dáil entered into rancorous debate on the old symbolic issues of the Crown, the Empire and the Oath, with Northern Ireland and the Boundary Commission hardly featuring. Symbolically, the future of Northern Ireland occupied only 9 out of 338 paragraphs of the record of the treaty debates in December 1921 and January 1922. Ironically, both pro- and anti-treaty elements in Dáil supported the Boundary Commission proposal, as it seemed to promise the end of, or at least a reduction of, partition. The major issue affecting partition in the Anglo-Irish Treaty was the Boundary Commission proposal. But partition itself at this stage was an abstract concept, and really only became a practical issue with the establishment of a new nationalist government in the South the following year. Even though the Irish negotiators knew how anxious the Unionists were about the uncertainty created about this proposal, they failed to forensically examine the issue. The exact meaning of what the British meant by economic and geographic conditions was never probed, and so the scene was set for the Irish Boundary Commission to determine what the border between North and South should be. The Commission's recommendations, or more specifically, the response of the 3 governments to these recommendations, determined the nature of the boundary for the next century. The Articles of Agreement, signed on the 6th of December 1921, and more colloquially known as the Anglo-Irish Treaty, created the Irish Free State, with dominion status similar to that pertaining at the time in Canada and Australia. In fact, Article 2 of the treaty specified that the relationship of the Crown and the Imperial Parliament to the new Dominion should be that of the United Kingdom and the Dominion of Canada. The new political entity would take on a share of the United Kingdom national debt and would not raise a defence force greater in proportion to the population than that of the United Kingdom. British use of the treaty ports in peacetime and other facilities in war were guaranteed, but after 5 years, Irish defence of the coast was conceded, subject to agreement by joint conference. The provisions in respect of Northern Ireland maintained the terms of the 1920 Government of Ireland Act for a month after the official establishment of the Irish Free State. This occurred when the Irish Free State Constitution Act received royal assent on the 6th of December 1922. During which Northern Ireland could opt out of the new settlement. If this happened, the status quo with Northern Ireland as constituted in 1921, staying in the United Kingdom, would remain. If Ulster chose to join the Free State, the Northern Ireland Parliament would remain, but as a devolved assembly from Dublin. If Northern Ireland opted out of the Free State, Article 12 of the treaty provided for the establishment of a Boundary Commission with 3 representatives, 1 from Northern Ireland, 1 from the Free State and 1 from the United Kingdom. On the 7th of December 1922, Northern Ireland exercised its right under the treaty to remain outside the Free State. The treaty offered Irish nationalists complete independence in domestic affairs, including full fiscal autonomy in the 26-county jurisdiction. It is also arguable that given the rapidly evolving nature of Dominion status inside the British Commonwealth, that its external freedoms would also be wide-ranging and likely to expand. The Irish negotiators were persuaded by Lloyd George to accept the treaty because he argued that Ireland's essential unity was given recognition, first of all, by the facility of allowing Northern Ireland to join the Irish Free State if it chose to, and if it didn't, by the continuation of the Council of Ireland from the 1920 Government of Ireland Act. In addition, the Boundary Commission could potentially redraw the border, and there was an expectation, or hope, on the Republican side, which Lloyd George assiduously cultivated, that the transference of much of the territory occupied by the substantial Roman Catholic community in Northern Ireland to the Irish Free State would make it difficult for the northern state to survive. It was a substantial negotiating achievement on the part of Lloyd George to give the impression to the Irish representatives that the establishment of a boundary commission would lead to Irish unity, especially as he had maintained throughout negotiations that the British government was rigidly adhering to the two conditions that Ireland must remain part of the empire and that Ulster must not be coerced. Despite this, the Irish signed the treaty, convinced that the Boundary Commission was their best opportunity of ending partition. It was only after Ulster and the Conservative Party were reassured by the Government of Ireland Act that Lloyd George was able to deal with militant Republicans in the south. The southern negotiators, led by Michael Collins, were adamant that the Anglo-Irish Treaty should supersede the previous year's Government of Ireland Act, in the same way as that act had replaced the pre-war Home Rule legislation. Ulster Unionists were adamant that this was not their understanding. The Anglo-Irish Treaty, with its introduction of a boundary commission, which could potentially amend the border, threatened the viability of Northern Ireland in a way that the Government of Ireland Act did not. "What we have we hold," said Northern Ireland's Prime Minister, the Unionist Sir James Craig, asserting the Unionist commitment to the Government of Ireland Act. The Act had not only established the panoply of a separate legislature in Northern Ireland, but had also established a border which to the Unionists was now inviolate. To the Unionists, it was not the Anglo-Irish Treaty which had created partition, it had already been created the year before by the Government of Ireland Act. The further irony was that the Anglo-Irish Treaty was also supposed to facilitate the future unification of Ireland, creating as it did one government for the Irish Free State, a dominion of the British Commonwealth, including the 6 previously excluded counties. However, it temporarily suspended the new government's jurisdiction over Northern Ireland and allowed the Ulster Parliament to permanently exclude itself from the new Irish Free State, a choice that it immediately took. After this self-exclusion, the terms of the 1920 Act remained in force in the now permanently excluded area. These terms included more restrictive financial provisions for Northern Ireland than it would have enjoyed as part of the Irish Free State, which had been granted fiscal independence by the treaty, so that there was a very real financial inducement for the Unionists to join a united Ireland. Furthermore, Northern Ireland's decision to exclude itself from the Irish Free State triggered the establishment of a boundary commission to determine the permanent course of the Irish border. The presence of Conservative ministers, upholders of Ulster Unionist interests in Lloyd George's coalition government, and as signatories of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, was meant to enable Ireland to be finally diffused as a potent issue in British politics. The Conservatives were in a strategic position to ensure that Lloyd George had to take into account Unionist fears and susceptibilities when negotiating with the representatives of radical Irish nationalism. The Conservative leadership was also, by and large, able to keep its die-hard pro-Unionist element in check and to stop it sabotaging any potential accommodation to be arrived at between the government and Sinn Féin. Notwithstanding this, the Boundary Commission provision in the Anglo-Irish Treaty caused immediate consternation amongst all Unionists and many Conservatives. The treaty did not specify whether the Commission would have the ability to make only minor adjustments to the new border, or whether it would be able to transfer sufficient swathes of Northern Ireland to the new Free State, thus making partition unviable and reunification inevitable. The central issue of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the future relationship of nationalist Ireland to the United Kingdom, was replaced by a new controversy over the future of the Irish border, despite the fact that the very existence of the Boundary Commission clause in the treaty was a tacit acceptance of the fact that a separate and already established Northern Ireland would be able to exercise its right to opt out of a united Ireland. In reality, the Boundary Commission proposal posed no real threat to the Ulster Unionists, despite the consternation it caused. It was understandable that the Boundary Commission element should cause such, ultimately misplaced, anxiety to Unionists, but the furore it led to overshadowed the fact that in the negotiations, nationalist Ireland had been presented with a fait accompli. With Northern Ireland already in possession of a functioning parliament, government and security apparatus, the constitutional position of Protestant Ulster had already been secured by the time the fate of the rest of the country was decided. During the treaty negotiations, the representatives negotiating on behalf of the doctrinaire Republicans of Sinn Féin considered the principle of independence from Westminster and total Irish sovereignty to be more important than the supposedly temporary exclusion of the 6 northeastern counties. This position would ultimately lead to the Irish Civil War after the treaty had been agreed. Thanks very much.